Hello, I'm James Warren.
And I'm Andy Cushen.
And this is the Denver Urbanism Podcast, a podcast on all things city building in the average city of Denver.
Wait, average? What do you mean?
Well, we're talking about par, King.
It's the episode you and I have been longing for. Tell me a story, James. I want to hear this story.
Well, okay, so we're going to harken back to the year 2024.
I remember it well.
Anno Domini 2024. You are a developer who wants to build a medium-height, 4-story apartment building that has a unique layout and lots of airflow and sunlight and, frankly, nice retail spaces on the bottom floor. Maybe a coffee shop or something.
I can see it.
You start going through the process and realize that, oh, wait, you can't build your unique designs because your building needs 2 points of entry. Despite the fact that your building takes all of the best fire precautions, the Community Planning and Development Office says, sorry, we can't help you. That's the law. Okay, you're frustrated, but you keep working on your designs, intent on making something great for the community.
I'm persistent.
Yes, you're tenacious in spite of all of these struggles. And as you design, you realize that you can't include retail on the bottom floor like you wanted. Because of parking minimums, that space has to go to parking, and finances don't really pencil out if you put those spaces underground. So you end up building a cube structure with parking on the bottom. You get accused of not really caring about the community and just doing what everybody else does.
You guys don't understand. I had to. They made me do it. Made me do it. Made me do it. Made me do it.
Now, fast forward. The year is 2025. You're that same developer who wants to build a medium-height, 4-story apartment building that has unique layout with lots of airflow and sunlight and nice retail spaces on the bottom. And you just get to do it. This is putting a point on the fact that we have taken some steps that seem sort of esoteric and hard to understand at first, but have real implications for our built form in the city. 1 year ago, you needed to have 2 staircases to enter a building above a certain height, and you needed to have parking provided. And now neither of those things is true. What this does is it kind of cracks the nut for interesting, sort of like low-medium residential development in our city. We didn't really talk about single stair when that came around, but we are today talking about parking minimums.
I am at this point getting questions from regular lay people left and right. James had plugged, that we had a really cool workshop in Curtis Park just this last week in a previous episode, and it went so well. I had so much fun. It was so cool. Thank you if you came out and participated. The practitioners did an amazing job. The audience then for the kind of presentation the practitioners gave was great. The panel discussion was great. Daryl Watson, a councilman, was there.
Oh,
it was so sick. And one of the 5 questions that we got after the presentation was, what does this whole parking minimum repeal mean? Are we going to have problems? Because maybe it seems like we might, but also I think we all in this room want there to be a better city where we don't have to drive as much. And it was the most nicely intentioned, normal kind of question. James, is the repeal of parking minimums going to change my lifestyle or day-to-day experience in the near term?
No. The street parking in front of your house or in front of your office or wherever you go shopping, that's not going away. Nobody's saying that there can't be parking in the city of Denver. All we're saying is that there doesn't have to be, by law, parking spaces provided at any of those locations. So in the future, right, those parking lots may be redeveloped. There may be a new retail center there. There may be new housing there. But especially in the near term, there's going to be really no impact to you as an average Denverite who isn't looking to develop a parcel of land. In fact, I think that something that we're going to realize is that eliminating parking from new developments is harder than we realize because of financing. While it's great to have it off the books, financiers still desire parking at their locations because it's an amenity. And so developers are still going to include parking on new developments, even if otherwise we might not want them to.
I just needed to get that question right off my chest. For the other people, for the well-intentioned, for your friend who's listening now because you recommended this to them. So you're telling me that no great change happened on Monday night. No great overnight, my parking in my neighborhood did not evaporate. That's right. I will still be able to drive to work this Monday if I like to do that.
Yeah, although there will be probably some immediate changes for businesses who have felt that their place is overparked. So Cerebral Brewing is a great example of this. There was a story earlier this year where Cerebral Brewing was required to take away this beautiful patio that they had on their parking lot because the city said you're not meeting your parking minimum requirements. So Cerebral Brewing on Monday, August 11th, is able to reconvert that into a patio again. They still include accessible parking for people who need that, but they are deciding to do something else with their land. And it was a huge loss, both for the owner of Cerebral and for the community, that you couldn't enjoy the outdoors in that way. So there will be some changes like that we might see incrementally, but really on a day-to-day basis, you're not going to notice anything monumental.
I'll give you another example. I was looking desperately in permits because I really wanted to see if something like fun had changed. And the only one I could find is that there was like a modification to an existing affordable housing site in Park Hill where they wanted to convert 6 parking spots into like a child's play area. Devastating stuff.
Yeah.
World-altering stuff. But so like, why then has this been something that matters? I think takes a second of unpacking. Like, I mean, I will always recall with fondness and excitement the Eras tour with Ken Truppel. I recommend it, dear listener, if you have not listened.
Go listen now. We'll wait. Okay, welcome back.
Welcome back. But parking minimums are the kind of term of art here. We have not had parking minimums since the year that General Larimer walked into the confluence of Cherry Creek and South Platte and said this'll do. Right. Parking minimums are new.
Yeah.
I live in a house that is older than parking minimums.
Yes, I live in a house that's the same age as parking minimums.
Oh, congratulations to you. Yes, happy days. So parking minimums were introduced in Denver because they're an urban planning concept. And like a lot of things, they kind of come into favor. And then at this point, we, I think, have realized from several decades of practice with parking minimums in effect in Denver that they are doing something bad. So in 1956, I thought it was that parking minimums were added into Denver's zoning code. You actually found something from 1953.
Yeah, so Denver their first approach was to take a few business districts A, B, and C, which I don't know what that refers to anymore.
There were only 3 skyscrapers back in 1953.
So there were 3 business districts that this applied to, and these were parking reforms that weren't citywide, and they did more or less parking minimums in these business districts. And for some historical flavor, here is a headline that shared the newspaper with the one announcing the parking minimums in 1953. Square dancing therapy is an aid to the mentally ill. Which, honestly, it might be. We should keep looking into that.
Pop off king. Yeah, I don't know why people aren't talking about this. Yeah.
So, and also just in the language of the 1953 bill, one thing they say is hospitals, including sanatoriums, asylums, orphanages, convalescent homes, and homes for the aged and infirm, and similar institutions, would be required to provide 1 off-street parking space for each 4 patient beds.
James, that must be scientifically derived, right?
Yes. This is the nature of parking minimums. They were more or less derived out of thin air. People just made them up. Why, for instance, does it say that theaters, including motion picture houses, would be required to provide at least 1 off-street parking space for each 4 seats or for each 20 inches of bench space? Because somebody made that up.
It's made up. I mean, it's just made up. It's made up completely and totally. And so then in that regard, the made-up existence of parking minimums has been fiddled with ever since. In 1956, downtown never had parking minimums, right? So we have always had different parking minimums. A movie theater in one part of town, downtown, didn't actually require parking. And a sanatorium in a different part of town did. We always had disparities in the way that parking was then kind of managed and sort of required of developers. And again, I live in a house that's older than the parking minimums being introduced to the Denver zoning code. We actually had a lot of existing buildings in 1953 that didn't have parking or didn't have room for parking. So what was the effect of putting those parking minimums into place? How would you characterize that?
You talk about these buildings that were older than parking minimums. And one of the things that's included in the code is that if it wasn't retroactive, but if you changed the building at all, if you were to make a modification to the building, you were then required to find those parking spaces. And so We actually have examples where buildings were destroyed in order to provide the necessary parking because somebody wanted to do something new with a lot. It's a terrible end case. And it's sad because one of the justifications from the community planning and development back in the day, they said, in the long-range economic view, this proposal will enhance land values and will noticeably lessen traffic congestion on the street.
I mean, you got to give it up, James. It worked, right? We have no traffic congestion ever in Denver. That's not something that we have. So it worked, so there it is.
And I'll also say one last thing to point out about the historical example is that the primary reason they didn't require parking minimums in the downtown district is because they said off-street parking can and will be provided as a private business, separate from the offices and stores which generate the demand. This is an insane thing for them to observe and then to not apply at the city level, right? If there's enough demand for parking, some entrepreneur is going to come in and build a garage or build a lot and do that themselves. They recognize that explicitly for downtown. But for the rest of the city, they say, nope, everybody has to have parking minimums. It worked well enough in districts A, B, and C, so now the whole city is going to have them. And it's been very bad.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's not hard for you, dear listener, to imagine, the sort of somewhat suburban apartment complex that maybe you first moved into when you moved out here somewhere east of Colorado Boulevard or south of Alameda. What did that look like? The shape of that building, the sort of suburban apartment complex I'm describing, comes from parking minimums.
Right.
Those weird office buildings on Colorado Boulevard. Sorry, Colorado Boulevard. I'm just going to pick on you for a minute. That have the kind of understory of parking, before the actual structure begins above it. That's totally shaped by parking minimums. Even your dentist's office or, again, a movie theater. All of this is sort of shaped or in adversity to the parking minimums that were required. And a whole city sort of became subject to a series of rules that had nothing to do with who lived in it, but just the current way people got around.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to live in an apartment that was a 5-minute walk from the light rail in West Colfax. You've been there. Great place. We had 6 units, and they were each 2 bedrooms, and we had 10 parking spaces. But my apartment was Section 8 qualified, and as we know, lower-income people tend to have cars at a lower rate than wealthier people. And so there were maybe 3 or 4 cars at any time in that parking lot. And so there were 6 spaces that were wasted. Not only is that just kind of ecologically devastating and stupid to do, but the developer could have built, instead of 6 units, 9 units. And they didn't do that, which meant that those costs couldn't be defrayed among the people who lived there. So it sounds trite to say, but the built form is affected by land use decisions. And if we decide to allocate a ton of land to empty cars, then we're going to have less homes, less interesting businesses, less walkable spaces.
I mean, less green spaces too. You had a wonderful garden in the back of that place. I think about, you have a wonderful garden here as well, but I just remember kind of you putting every bit of little green space around that apartment building you were living in to work. And that just can't be done then to half the lot. So we're going to kind of end cap on some level how bad the sort of status quo was. Yeah. But I just want to kind of go down a small list of things. I'm describing just the last 15 years of Denver history here, right? And each and every one of the things I'm just going to describe to you, I'm distilling to sort of a bullet point. And yet they were big fights, big arguments, lots of stakeholders who had lots of opinions, wah, cry about it. So for instance, in 2010, right, the sort of existing parking minimums we're describing from 1956, in 2010, we updated a zoning code. And we started to fiddle then with kind of the idea of where parking would be placed. And to say that in specific contexts of the city, a business 3 blocks away from the Capitol is not in the same kind of context as a business 15 miles away from the Capitol in Southeast Denver. You can maybe have a different opinion about whether or not you think everything should aspire to have the type of walkable mixed-use urbanism that's illegal to build these days. But, you can have that opinion. In 2010, then, we introduced a specific type of zoning that kind of controlled where the parking was based in order to try and make it more walkable and nice for pedestrians. We also introduced in 2010, with the new zoning code, some alternative minimum parking ratios. So, you've heard people say in the lead up to the parking minimum repeal that 1 parking space was required per unit. That is not true and has not been true for 15 years. And I just want that kind of nonsense to be cut out right here. So if you were adjacent to high frequency transit, which was sort of an opportunity in the zoning code, you could just take a flat 25% reduction. And there was sort of a separate minimum ratio for like building small units, which is something people complain about, but is one of the reasons that we got a lot of small units in the last 15 years of Denver's building boom. If you built something less than 550 square feet, which is pretty small, you only had to build like a quarter, of a spot per unit. Okay, so those things happened in 2010, right? Those modified the sort of status quo. Well, then we said, you know what, we should do something for Rhino because that's really popping off and we want this to sort of be like a unique urban district. And so then there was an incentive overlay which reduced parking minimums and said within a half mile of a transit station, this is like fairly progressive thinking, within a half mile of a transit station, you actually just like don't need to provide any parking. So it was all optional at that point. And then pre-COVID, the city goes, parking's expensive. Gosh, this is really troublesome. There was sort of a prominent example of, an affordable housing developer that couldn't get an approval because they didn't have a site that allowed them to build enough parking to sort of match the number of homes. So then the city said, okay, here's a progressive step. If you have an affordable home, it actually only requires 1/10 of a parking space, which is closer to being mathematically true to what is observed in affordable housing in Denver. There was like a study done by like Shopworks architects and other folks. Okay, so that was pre-COVID. Then what we did is we have had progressive rezonings post-COVID. So we like rezoned Golden Triangle and Arapahoe Square and, lower downtown, which are sort of adjacent to downtown, and we got rid of parking there. Great. Then we passed a big policy, which we have yet to do any sort of deep dive episode on, but expanding housing affordability, which then said, hey, if you comply with this costly thing to provide some affordable housing within your development, you can just take a haircut to parking minimums. And so that cut like everything by like 0.5 spaces. So again, we were like nowhere close to this one space notion. Listen to all of those things and try and keep track of the fact that 20 inches of bench space requires one parking spot. Like, how do you apply those things? How do you square that circle? It's bureaucratese. It is like, I have seen so many of these tables filled out by like well-intentioned developers that are ultimately just making shit up because they don't know what the number is. And so I'll give you the latest example. Literally like last month, I saw a submission for a 100% affordable housing building within a quarter mile of the like 40th and Colorado A-line stop, right? This is a great place to build affordable housing, right? If you were listening to the news and the news kept saying, like one, parking space per home, you would have been surprised then by the fact that the developer in their little site table kind of listed that they were required to provide 0.8. Well, that's not wrong, actually, because, 0.75 is sort of the haircut EHA gives, if you're a compliant project. But then again, remember, it's a 100% affordable housing building. So like the 300 units that they're going to build, you can apply 0.1 to that. So they only require 30. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, I forgot. EHA actually means that like you can have 0 parking spots if it's a 100% affordable housing building within a quarter mile of transit. Yeah. And so like you can earnestly believe that you are a well-informed person on this subject and be wrong 3 times. And you can be the developer and be wrong and be sort of barking up the wrong tree.
Andy, wait a minute. Wouldn't it just be simpler to just say 0? Everybody just does 0 if you want, and build however much you want. We're not going to get in your way.
That is the exact point of doing this kind of reform at this point. So the city's hand was forced here, right? Like this is true that this was sort of required. There was a state law. It was HB 24-1304. This was a YIMBY win. This happened 2 years ago and sort of came into effect at the end of June this year, right? Or 2 sessions ago, I should say. But that law was like very specific, right? Polis's goal with these kind of laws and the Democrats' goals with these kind of laws in the Colorado State House has been like housing production. Yeah. And so essentially it said like, if you are within a quarter mile of a transit area and you're proposing something that is either housing or is an adaptive reuse that is like 50% or more housing, then you are not subject to parking requirements. And when the city looked at the map and the kind of mess and the spaghetti thrown on top of their existing, already bureaucrated to the max system of parking requirements, thank God they took the step, as you just said, of just going to 0.
Right.
Just make the number 0.
We would have had this in St. Patrick because it was based on whether you're within a quarter mile of an RTD stop or a transit stop that had 30-minute frequency or higher during certain periods of the day. That's like 70 to 80% of the city.
Yeah.
And so you would just have like these circles all over the city. And like, my neighbor is 0.26 miles away from the transit stop and I'm 0.25. So I don't have any, but they do. Like, it would have just been a mess. And the simplest thing to do would have just been to eliminate them citywide. But advocates partner with the city, and then we actually went further. The city didn't just eliminate parking minimums for residential uses. They eliminated parking minimums for all uses in the city. This is a phenomenal win by the city. And I really think that we should applaud the people who sponsored this and who pushed this forward, because it really does change how everybody can build in the city and the types of spaces that we get to be around.
There has been one new project in permits that seems to know that parking minimums are no longer required. That was fun. It's also a wacky thing. I think I might like hide the ball a little bit on some of the details because I'd love to call up this architect related to single stair stuff. However, it really is just that simple. If you are designing a building for a site, you know going in what your constraints are. Zoning still has all of these other constraints, right? Like, you're not allowed to build like right up to the lot line in most cases. This isn't New York City, you know, and I guess we like want to have like 3 feet of air, you know, on either side of the building. So like you have to have like a setback from the street, and you have to have a sidewalk, and it has to look like this, and you know, you have to have alley access for blah 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 for like, you know, trash pickup. Like there are still rules around how people can kind of like physically navigate your site.
Yeah.
None of those rules changed. And the accessibility component is something that I have heard people who I will decide to describe as sincere, like, you know, mischaracterize. ADA applies when somebody chooses to build parking.
Yeah.
Right? So like the parking minimums did not require ADA parking. ADA parking is required when anybody chooses to build parking.
Yeah.
So like someone who wants to build one parking space now, which is now allowed, you know, if you want to build one parking space for your like dentist's office off of East Colfax, that has to be ADA accessible.
Yep.
Congrats. That's it. But if they have no parking being added at all, that's probably closer to the status quo anyways, you know, because they are just reusing an old building or something like that and wanted to make it a dentist instead of a restaurant. There is no disproportionately negative impact then. Like, there's no discriminatory impact.
Right.
Because there's no parking being provided for anybody.
Yeah. And it's a bit anecdotal, but, you know, I have done advocacy in the pedestrian space for a long time, and people who were fighting against this often were people with disabilities who used wheelchairs to get around. One of the primary sponsors for this on city council himself uses a wheelchair to get around. That's Chris Hines. And so I think sometimes people use folks with disabilities as almost like a scapegoat or to get what they want. But if you look at the people who are pushing for this, it wasn't that the Cross Disability Coalition wasn't advocating against this, right? They were not at the hearing showing up and saying this is discriminatory. So I think that the fears of this disproportionately affecting people with disabilities is significantly overblown, and frankly is probably using those people in order to push forward whatever agenda somebody's pushing, which is that just sucks.
They call this like astroturfing. One more thing just to say about this. Advocates like Yimby's, who we've had on the podcast before, will tell you, and I think people are really starting to get this, that the city does need to upzone to allow more housing close to transit, but also just like in existing like urban neighborhoods, right? I think it is worthwhile to sort of pause on the fact that this is a type of upzoning.
Yeah.
Your anecdote at the beginning of my crushed dream of being a 4-story developer who wants to put, ground floor retail and have some like rooms on the first floor of my building, but is not allowed to do that because I had to do parking on the first floor. You can take more of the site and dedicate it towards the actual thing that you want to build on that site. Even though like you didn't get more floors of building here, this is in fact an opportunity for you to then build more of your project and build your project in the way that you would have preferred to. You might still want to include parking because you think parking will make you money, because you think parking is a valuable addition to your project. The other thing that then kind of gets to happen because of this, and I'm really excited for this, is that we had, related to the fact that parking minimums were required in Denver, like all sorts of then like kind of exceptions, right? So requiring parking out of a developer is kind of a taking, in the sort of tax thought. And so then it's not fair to count the taking of the parking that you're requiring them to do towards the floor area ratio, or even towards like kind of the building height in some certain cases. And so parking garages have been able to like exceed building height in some kind of cases. That changed, like 6 months ago because of the little cleanup on the, in the zoning code. But like you have examples of developers who have used parking garages, excessively large parking garages, as sort of like an anti-urban tactic. So I remember there was this building that was proposed like down by like the tech center in the Denver sort of zoning code. And by like square footage, the building was 48% parking.
Oh, wow.
48% parking garage, right? So it lifted, so it was like 16 residences total, I think, and maybe like 70 parking spots.
Wow.
And each of the residences was like 2,000 square feet or whatever. It was just going to be like a real luxe tower. And in the stated rationale for the project, the developers said, stack parking to give residents premium views. Like that was like the sort of point of view. And so if that is so valuable, dear developer, why do you then get an exception to the kind of like size and shape of your building for doing parking? If that has a dollar value that is good for you, the city then should be able to like tax that and assess like a linkage fee on that and all those kind of other things. We've had this like warped system which has required and ignored the kind of like built form related to parking in Denver. And now we can like go to a more rational case where if you tell me in all earnestness that you think like parking will make your business better and you have the ability to like build out a parking spot, that like complies to the building code, not the zoning code, because there's no longer a part about parking lots in the zoning code, then like you will get taxed on that or sort of assessed on that on the merits of that idea alone.
Yeah.
And it just becomes a more rational thing where you don't have to check in with somebody else for permission related to this one particular aspect of your building. You just do it. So more interesting projects become possible. Adaptive reuse becomes possible in a lot of like new and exciting ways. And also like odd shaped lots, right? Like we don't have like Denver's a pretty rectilinear city, but we do have some kind of triangular lots. I was like biking by like Newton and 12th, there's like a Habitat for Humanity like sort of thing that's going in there. It would have been hard to fit like multifamily apartments, you know, like on that spot because parking requirements previously existed and would have required the parking to happen in some like badly difficult to maneuver kind of way. So, like, it's easy then to kind of leave spots like that as, I'll just have that single family because, you couldn't fit an apartment on there anyways. Now you can. Again, this is a type of upzoning in so many ways. And so I'm raving. I'm now in a raving way. We can stop my raving.
Rave on, King.
But so then, James, I have a couple other frequently asked questions for you.
Let's hear them.
Oh, yeah. This is Denver. I don't know if you know this, but everyone owns a car in Denver. Did you know?
That's not true.
Oh.
According to the American Community Survey, which is sort of like the in between the censuses, our yearly study of how Americans live, in Denver, about 10% of households don't have a car. And so whenever people are saying, well, like everybody owns a car in Denver, I mean, you're ignoring 1 out of every 10 Denverites. And so first, no, that isn't true. But also, the reason that those 90% of households do own a car is because society is set up so that you own a car. Parking minimums is a huge part of that. I found a few different studies that show that parking minimums are related causally to car ownership. One called How the Built Environment Affects Car Ownership and Travel. One called The Influence of Parking on Car Ownership. And one called Housing Parking Facilities, Relationship to Travel and Car Ownership. And all of these studies just basically show that when you start providing parking, when you start bundling parking with housing, people get cars. Not the other way around. It's not that people have cars and so they're demanding this parking. Parking causes car ownership. And so this is a huge part of that. This is not the outcome we want. If we want to make a walkable city where people are more able to get around on transit and foot and bike, then parking minimums actively fights against that.
But James, we don't yet live in that urbanist paradise where you can walk everywhere. People need their cars. People need them. So shouldn't we make a transit-rich, walkable environment first?
Well, okay, sort of. Part of the reason we don't have a transit-rich, walkable environment is because of abundant parking. And I'm going to tackle walkability first. Where are the worst places to walk? When you are walking by big asphalt parking lots, whether they have cars in them or not, it is terrible. You're not walking by a shop. You're not walking by active residences. You're not walking by anything that is interesting in the urban form. It makes walkability worse. It makes you want to drive more. And so when we legally require parking to be built, we are making walkable places illegal. So now I'm going to take the transit-rich component. People choose their mode of travel based on a number of different factors. That's all kinds of stuff, right? Is it raining out? What mood are you in? Do you have access to a car? Is transit frequent? Are you close enough to bike? There's all these different factors that go in that ultimately result in whatever mode you choose. When we subsidize parking, when we subsidize car use and ownership by providing parking everywhere, we are eliminating one of the competing factors in that decision matrix for you. So you aren't thinking, well, am I going to be able to find parking here? Because there's just going to be parking everywhere. In a place where developers are able to build what they think is the right market amount of parking, you might say, well, it might be hard to park downtown. I'm just going to take the bus. And you're going to ride the bus. And so transit ridership is up. And so RTD runs more lines or runs more frequent lines to your location because more people are riding. By basically making this a more competitive atmosphere in which transit can compete, we're going to have a more transit-rich end state. That takes years, but this is a part of the equation.
But then, James, some people in Denver live here for the mountains. You're not going to get them to give up their car because they're going to the mountains. You need your car for the mountains.
Sure. I'm happy that people have all kinds of hobbies, including going to the mountains to ski and to hike. That's great. I don't live here for that. You don't live here for that. Plenty of people in the city do not live here for the mountains. And so to require that we provide an amenity at every location because some people have a specific hobby is absurd. Imagine, for instance, that you lived in an apartment complex where, by law, every single apartment dweller was required to be provided with an icon pass every single year by the developer because everybody lives here for the mountains. If you were somebody who didn't go skiing or snowboarding, you would think, this is absurd. Why am I paying for an icon pass in my rent every month? Because other people like to do this. In the same way, parking spaces cost money and they have opportunity cost. All of that is disproportionately borne by people who don't have cars. And so we are taking people, and by the way, I must remind you that in Denver, poorer people are less likely to have cars than richer people. So we're saying those poorer people should subsidize the amenities of richer folks in our city. That is so regressive.
I'm going to break character for a second to say, too, like, if you earnestly do live here for the mountains, you know, or like really, really love the mountains, it's a big part of your identity out here. I know you. I see you. I have gone through phases of my life where I'm like very mountain pilled, and it's great. But think about like the experience of going to a trail that you know is going to be busy. You have to carpool. You have to actually try and get there more efficiently. And when you get there and the trailhead's full, you don't then sit there and go, crap, they need to demolish all these trees so they can build a bigger parking lot for the trailhead. Like, we understand that wilderness and pristine natural areas should be maintained and pristine and matter, and that they are more valuable than just having ample, abundant parking in those places. Why can't we exercise a little bit of that like love and desire for like fostering good places here at home? Why is it only in the mountains that we can exercise that kind of point of view, that there is something better than just demolishing stuff to put more parking there, you know?
Right. They are the least interesting spaces in our city. Parking lots suck.
Yeah.
And parking garages are terrible from an urban form perspective. Nobody likes to be around them. They may be useful and necessary right now, but like to require that we continue to build our city like that in perpetuity actively fights against the things that we want to happen.
Okay, returning to frequently asked questions. But James, poor people. I've met one once. I had known them, and I tell you, poor people need their cars in order to work. You can't do this to them, James.
What is this? It's like 1950s transatlantic accent.
Papers.
Well, I guess that, this is when parking minimums were put into place. So the 1950s is very appropriate. But car ownership scales with income. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because recent estimates have shown that the average vehicle costs the owner $10,000 to $12,000 a year in modern day America. That's everything from insurance, fuel costs, maintenance, depreciation of the vehicle. That's a huge burden. And it makes sense that lower income people are less able to bear that burden. And so you will often hear people say, well, the working poor people in the city have cars, need cars. That is not a good outcome. We don't want them to have to own or use cars all the time because it's a massive financial burden. If we could create a city, and this is part of that frees them from that, they're much more equipped to use those funds toward housing, toward medical bills, toward food, groceries. To argue that we need to keep our city car dependent because people are dependent on cars is backwards thinking and circular.
But I like my parking space.
Your parking space isn't going anywhere.
Oh.
The parking space that you have right now isn't going away today, tomorrow, in a long time. And if you like that parking space enough, in a distant future where parking is more limited, you can continue to pay for it. That is absolutely within your power. As we learned from the 1957 article, private developers will provide an amenity if they know people will pay for it. So if you love your parking space and you want to keep buying it, great. But the rest of society shouldn't have to subsidize that.
I feel like from all of the answers that you're giving me, James, and I'm being a little harsh to the people who do have these sincere questions, I just feel like it's a big change for the future.
Yeah.
But the city that you woke up in Tuesday morning, the night after parking minimums were repealed, is actually the same city as the prior day. And it's going to take a long time, just like it took a long time when we implemented parking minimums, for the repeal of parking minimums to change the city.
Yes, absolutely it will. And, dear listener, go look at some pictures of Denver from the early 1900s. I mean, this was a space with an interesting urban form, with vibrant streets, with just a downtown core that was very, very interesting. And by downtown here, I mean like greater downtown area. That was really interesting and great to be a part of. And then go look at some pictures from the 1970s, which I think was when it was the worst, right?
Mm-hmm. Bell-bottom jeans, like
the
a little bit of Jimi Hendrix, throw it all in there.
But the city had been leveled and replaced with parking lots. That isn't the direction we want to go. We want to go back to an era of interesting urban form, places you can walk, places you can exist as a human. And this is one component of this. If you're listening to this show, you probably already know all this stuff. If you haven't, if you want to learn more, you can either read Donald Shoup, rest in peace, his book called The High Cost of Free Parking. I wouldn't recommend it. That was one of the first books I read when I got into urbanism. It's 750 pages and reads like a textbook. Mm-hmm. Paved Paradise is a much more digestible version of this. It's a shorter book. It's more narrative driven.
Paved Paradise by Henry Graeber.
That's right. Yes. Go pick up a copy of that. It's a quick read, much easier to read. And you can really get into kind of why this is so absurd and why what Denver just did is really important and paves the way for a better Denver.
I just think in the future we're going to look back and there were periods of time where the river that goes through Cleveland was periodically on fire. And that happened because people made choices that resulted in pollution and a bad sort of relationship between the city and the river. I just think that we're going to look back in 50 years and be remember when we did that to ourselves?
Right.
Remember when we caused the urban heat island effect? Remember when we single-handedly killed off trees and urban ecology for this niche purpose that benefited rich people who don't live in this city? We're just going to look back and go that was crazy. We set the world on fire kind of about that. So, great first step to fixing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, phenomenal first step. Big thanks to City Council for passing this. Huge thanks to all the advocates. I saw a lot of people from YIMBY and the, Denver Bike Lobby and other folks who showed up to council to testify. Thank you to all of you for helping make this change in our city.
And thank you for listening. The Denver Urbanism Podcast is a production of longtime blog Denver Infill and sister blog Denver Urbanism. You can find more information at denverurbanism.com. Thanks very much. I like all of these. I think these were very nicely written out, James. We don't need to include me telling you them that they were written out.
Yeah, don't let the audience know you've ever complimented me.
That we've ever prepped for an episode.
Yeah.